In this lesson, we're going to begin our discussion of evolution by looking at the process of natural selection. So, what exactly is evolution? So, the definition is that evolution is the process during which there is a relative change in the inheritable characteristics of a species over time. And evolution can occur through a process called natural selection. So let's talk about natural selection. So, the premise behind natural selection. So, if you consider a population of organisms, generally they're going to produce more offspring than the environment can support. So, for various reasons, there might be limited food, limited space, predators, there are different things, but basically, some of the offspring are not going to make it. Or at least they're not going to make it long enough to have offspring of their own. So, because of this situation, you get a struggle for survival between individual organisms. And because that struggle to survival is happening, organisms that have specific adaptations, so a specific structure, specific behavior, a specific physiological process, the organisms that have those adaptations will be better able to survive. And so as a result, those organisms will have a better chance of passing on that characteristic to their offspring. So over time, those particular adaptations will become more prominent in the population. And as one generation follows another, the characteristics of the species gradually changes, or in other words, the species evolves. So we're going to look at that a bit more. So what are some of those adaptations we're talking about? So an organism within a population that is able to camouflage in order to hide from predators is going to have a better chance of survival and is going to pass on the genes that allow it to camouflage to its offspring. So if there's a population that some camouflage better than others, the better camouflaged organisms will eventually become more prominent in the population. Another example of an adaptation would be if an organism has a keen sense of smell that allows them to detect prey. So the organisms with the better smell are going to survive to reproduce more than those that don't have a keen sense of smell. Another example is mimicry. So, this is a process where you have a harmless species resembling a harmful species in order to be avoided by predators. So, the uh, monarch butterfly is poisonous and it has the colors to let the predators know that it is poisonous. And then there's another butterfly that looks the same but isn't poisonous, but predators think it is, and so it is better able to survive. So you've probably heard of Charles Darwin, and he is credited with developing the theory of evolution by natural selection. So he studied various natural populations for many, many years. And in his studies, he recognized that the struggle between individuals of the same species competing for limited resources had selected for the individuals that had traits that would increase their chances of surviving. So, that, in a nutshell, is natural selection. So, now let's look at the specific definition of natural selection. So, natural selection is a process whereby the characteristics of a population of organisms change because individuals with certain inheritable traits, those adaptations, survive their specific local environmental conditions and pass on their traits to their offspring. So that is a really long definition. And so we're going to look at three sort of key words in there that are really important to this process. So the first one is population. So it says the characteristics of a population of organisms change. So a population is the smallest unit that can evolve. Individual organisms are not able to evolve. And a population is defined as a group of individuals of the same species in the same area at the same time. So that group of individuals can evolve, but an individual organism can't evolve. In order for a population to be able to evolve, there must be variation within that population. So if every single organism in the population is exactly the same, that population is not going to be able to evolve. Now, that situation doesn't really happen in nature where everything is exactly the same, and that is because variation can arise through a couple different ways. So, one is mutations, and the second is through sexual reproduction. So, if a mutation occurs, it can create completely new genetic information, new alleles, new characteristics. So, that's one way we get variation in a population. And the other way is through sexual reproduction. So, we've talked about meiosis. Meiosis allows a huge variety of genetically different gametes to be produced by each individual. And then when there's fertilization, it brings alleles from two different individuals together in lots of different combinations to make a new individual. So these processes cause there to be a lot of variation in a population and allows the population to be acted on by natural selection. Let's go back to that definition. We've talked about the population. So the next word we're going to focus in on is inheritable. So it says individuals with certain inheritable traits. The characteristic that the environment is selecting for must be inherited. It has to be able to be passed on to offspring in order for natural selection to occur, because that's the only way you're going to get a change in the overall genetic makeup of the population. Acquired traits are not able to drive natural selection. And acquired traits are those that are developed during an individual's lifetime and are not determined directly by genetics. So this is really anything that you learn after you're born, something you're not born with. So for example, your ability to read and write is an acquired trait. And you can't pass that ability on to your children. Just because you've learned to read and write doesn't mean that then your child is going to be born already able to read and write. And even though that ability to read and write may be beneficial in the environment, it's not going to cause natural selection to occur because it can't be passed on to offspring. So that was inheritable, right? So the traits, they have to be able to be passed on to offspring. So then the last one we're going to focus in on is environmental. So we've got specific local environmental conditions. So in order for natural selection to occur, the environment must be exerting a selective pressure. And this is where the idea of natural selection also being referred to as survival of the fittest. And in this context, fitness is the suitability of an organism to the environmental conditions. So depending on the environment, the organisms that are best suited to live and reproduce are going to be the ones that pass on their genes. So if a simple example, if it is a cold environment, an organism that is covered in fur is going to be better able to survive and pass on the genetic information to be able to make fur to its offspring. So an important point here about the environment, the natural selection is situational because an environment can change. So, a characteristic that may not have given an individual organism an advantage in the current environment may become critical for survival in a later environment, or vice versa. So, a population of organisms may evolve through natural selection in one direction. So, they might become more furry, for example, if it's cold. But then, if the environment were to change and become warm, then the natural selection could work in the opposite direction and the population would change to favor organisms that were less furry, as an example. So, in summary, in order for natural selection to occur, there has to be diversity within a species. The variable trait must be inheritable. Organisms must produce more offspring than can survive. Members of the species must compete with one another for survival. And the environment must exert a selective pressure. So, that is the idea of natural selection as it applies to evolution.